Ottawa says it plans to hand over control of child welfare services to Indigenous governments. Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott announced today that legislation is coming in the new year. She says the tens of thousands of Aboriginal children in the foster care system is a humanitarian crisis.
For a century now, based on discriminatory policies of government, we have been taking children away from their families. It started with residential schools, it continued in the 60s scoop, and still today, children are being taken from their families. And this legislation marks a turning point to say no more.
The CBC's Jorge Barrera is on the story live from Ottawa. So Jorge, what else did Philpott say?
Well, the minister said that this new legislation, whenever it's tabled, is going to be based on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and it's going to be based on the UN Convention of the Child. She said she hopes it's going to end the discriminatory practice of apprehending children simply based on poverty. Now, this issue hit the federal government, this Liberal government, right after it came into power, after the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal in January 2016 found that Ottawa was discriminating against First Nations children by underfunding child welfare services on reserve. But Ottawa's come a long way since then. Like during the tribunal hearings, federal bureaucrats argued that, Ottawa has really no responsibility over this. All we do is cut the check and services are delivered through provincial and territorial law. And that's the jurisdictional question that arises of this. And Minister Philpott also said that there's varying states of enthusiasm from provincial and territorial governments about the intent of this legislation. How is it going to fit with this federal legislation that's going to basically give space to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit rights to take care and govern their own child welfare systems, when right now the provinces and territories are the ones which have laws that govern the child welfare system. Nevertheless, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit leaders sounded hopeful notes about the potential for this legislation. Here's a little bit of what they had to say.
This is going to be a spot where, yes, it's federal legislation, but it's going to be co-developed, and ultimately there will be First Nations legislation at some point as well. But this legislation will be based on language, customs, traditions, so those children that are lost in that system can come back home.
So Jorge, do we have any idea about what this new Indigenous-led system will look like?
Well, the key word there is co-developed. And this idea for this enabling legislation has been around since for about 20 years. So, the government knows what people want. And one of the things they want, and I spoke with Cindy Blackstock, the prominent child welfare advocate who led the human rights complaint, she said the government needs to change its rules that requires First Nations to conform to provincial and territorial laws in order to get funding for child welfare services. She says that has to change, and Nate Obed, the president of ITK, the Inuit organization, said, I want to see data collection. I don't know how many Inuit children are in care or where they are. So how this legislation is actually going to get all these different jurisdictions to compile data remains to be seen. There's also not a lot of time left for the government to get this through. There's about 14 parliamentary sitting weeks in 2019 and January to near the end of June to get this through. People are going to want to testify. There's going to be committee hearings. So, the government has a long road to go in a short time to get this done.
All right, Jorge, thank you. The CBC's Jorge Barrera in Ottawa.